Hi, everyone. Welcome to the online seminar on mathematical foundations of data science. Thanks for joining today. Our seminar is generously sponsored by 2 Sigma. So before introducing the speaker, we would like to inform you that Professor Michael Jordan's talk has been rescheduled to August 11th. Sorry for the inconvenience. It's my real pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Professor Samory Kpotufe from Columbia University. Professor Kpotufe obtained his PhD of computer science from UCSD in 2010. Prior to joining Columbia, he has been a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems, and then an assistant research professor at the TTIC, and then spent over 4 years at Orpheus Princeton as an assistant professor, where I personally had the pleasure to work with him as a teaching assistant and also being his student. Professor Kpotufe has made many fundamental contributions in non-parametric methods and statistical machine learning. He has written many great articles in these fields that tackle the fundamental problems in these areas. He has served as the area chairs or action editors in many top journals and conferences such as JMLR, SML, NeurIPS, and CODE. He's generously interested in designing adaptive procedures, i.e. How to automatically leverage beneficial aspects of data as opposed to designing specifically for each scenario. In specific, his research interests include notions of intrinsic data dimensions, sparse or manifold representations, performance limits and adaptivity in active learning, transfer learning, and multitask learning, hyperparameter tuning, and density-based clustering. Today, he is going to introduce some recent insights on transfer learning. Please join me in welcoming him.
All right. Thanks a lot, Zoran. Thanks a lot for the invitation to the seminar. So I'll be talking about transfer learning, and especially some recent work I've been doing with Steve Haneke. Much of the work I'll be sort of talking about, the initial intuition started with work on the non-parametric side with Guillaume Martinet. And recently I've been building up on this intuition with Steve Haneke on the parametric side. And by parametric side, I mean classification with finite capacity classes, finite VC classes, and such things. And so that's sort of what I'll talk about today. All right. So quickly, I'll explain what I mean by transfer learning and motivate it. So transfer learning or domain adaptation in machine learning concern this type of setting. So the setting is one where you have a lot of data from a particular distribution P, and you want to produce a classifier. However, the classifier is for another distribution. So why is this? So let's look at a simple case study. So the case study is that of Apple's Siri voice assistant. So some years ago, Apple came up with a Siri. However, mostly trained it on American English speakers. And so we'll view what they trained it on as P. So we'll call that the source. And so they trained it on American English speech. And the result of it was that it would quickly recognize American accents and understand American speakers, but it would not understand people like me, right? Interestingly enough, very recently, they did some study where it is still unable to understand, say, Scottish accents. So what is the issue? The issue is that it was trained on a particular distribution of data, and but had to be deployed towards a different population. So that different population, I'll call it a target, and that's what I'm representing by Q here. So what they had to do was retrain, collect a lot more data that is much more representative of the target population, and retrain, and that's quite expensive. And the goal of transfer learning or domain adaptation is how do we quickly transfer machine learning software from a particular train on a particular distribution to a related distribution, to a related population. So I hope the goal is clear. The problem of transfer happens to be in a lot of applications. So here some quick examples. AI for judicial systems. You have a source population that happens to be people who are already in the judicial system, and you have a target population that happens to be nearly everyone. So these are AI software that are supposed to do risk assessment on people essentially that just got arrested. And they are interestingly being used in different states, but now people are realizing that they should not be used because they were trained on non-representative data. So you have this type of issue where the whole, at the very core of the issue is that data is expensive, and getting representative data for your target population is expensive. So in a lot of industries, or in science and in engineering, you tend to acquire data that is not fully representative. So you acquire data from a particular population or a particular distribution P, and yet you want to do well on a different distribution. So I hope the setting is clear. So because of that, this sort of problem of domain adaptation has been recognized for a long time now. And there are tons of practical solutions, all sort of heuristics to try and address the problem. And the theory of transfer learning is catching up still. So, so the talk will be about that, about the theory of transfer learning, and trying to address some of the interestingly open problems. So basic questions, as when we started looking at this a few years back, basic questions sort of were still unanswered. So again, recall, H hat is a classifier that is trained on source data from a distribution P, and which is to be transferred to target data under a distribution Q. So a first question, sort of a practical, but at the same time theoretical question. A first question is there sufficient information in the source P about the target Q? And what do we even mean by information here, right, as it applies to classification? If there is not enough information, how much new data should be collected? How much data from the target application should be collected? Another question is, would unlabeled data help? And so here, to make that question clear, in machine learning, and in the practice of transfer learning, one of the common things is to try and use much cheaper unlabeled data from the target to help transfer. And so the question here, the theoretical question here is, does unlabeled data help, and to what extent does it help? Another question which comes from practice is, how do I put it? Imagine that you have, and that's the case in practice often, imagine that you have different costs of acquiring source and target data. Usually acquiring the source data is cheaper financially, and the target data is more expensive. And so given that you have different costs at acquiring the source and target data, is there a notion of optimal financial cost of acquiring data given a particular performance goal on the target, right? And so you can imagine people like Facebook, Google have to make such decisions all the time, given so many sources of data at different costs. Which source should they leverage, and how should they leverage it to quickly attain the desired classification error? So I hope these questions are clear. At the core of essentially all these questions is, what's the relative statistical value of data from P and data from Q? What do they bring to each other, the source and target data? This question itself depends on how, quote unquote, how far P is from Q. I hope that is clear. And so because it depends on how far P is from Q, and we don't know yet how we define far, and by far we sort of mean something similar to the first question here, is there sufficient information in P about Q, right? What do we mean by far? What do we mean by information? And so much of the first part of the talk would focus on this, trying to understand what do we even mean by how far toward addressing these various questions. I hope that's clear. And Zoran, also feel free to interrupt me if needed, if someone has a clarification type question.
Sure.
Thanks. All right, so how far is P from Q, and what do we mean by far? So essentially, you can imagine that every notion of distance between distributions has been tried in the theory of transfer. So how do we proceed? We're going to proceed formally as follows. We are in classification, X to Y. We assume here, and that's what I meant by we are looking at the parametric case. We assume here that we have a finite VC class H. And all we mean by VC, for those who are not familiar with VC, all we mean is some bound on the capacity of the model class. The hypothesis class is sort of the model class. It's sort of the set of algorithms that you are searching through. So H could be a set of neural networks that you are searching through, or H could be particular configurations of random forest, and so forth, okay? So you have a finite hypothesis class, that's your algorithm, that's your choice algorithm. You have a finite VC class, sorry, the hypothesis class is not finite, it's infinite, but its capacity is finite. And then you are given source data, NP, data points, label data points from P, from the source, and NQ, label data points from the target. Here, if you recall, the question we were asking again is what is the relative statistical value of data from P and data from Q? So what we are doing here is assuming that we have a classifier that has data from both P and Q, and we want to understand what is the best possible classification rate under the target that such a classifier can achieve. And how does that rate express under NP and NQ? And what's the relation between P and Q that captures that rate in a tight manner? And that starts answering some of the questions I posed earlier. So again, the goal is excess target error. So the excess 0-1 classification risk, excess with respect to the best possible classifier in the VC class H. And the basic question is this epsilon Q of H hat, what is the best possible epsilon Q of H hat that is achievable in terms of any sample size from the target and any sample size from the source and any sample size from the target. And which notion of quote unquote distance between P and Q captures this error. So as I said before, there are many competing notions. Essentially, any notion of distance between distributions that you can imagine, whether it's actual notions of metric or notions of divergence, people have tried nearly any such notion. So the literature on notions of distributions with respect to transfer learning is very large. So what I'll do next is try to just tell you a little bit about the main directions. So here I'll keep using this little cartoon where in the source distribution, we have source and target distributions over the same type of object. However, there is a shift between the two. So we have a lot more of these triangles here than in this case here. So it's a simple example, and I'll use the example to illustrate a lot of the ideas. So one big line of research here is to use extensions of total variation as a notion of discrepancy between the source and target. And by extensions of total variation, all I mean is that these notions consider the difference in mass between P and Q over particular subsets of the space. Often the subset of the space are defined by the hypothesis class you've chosen, the set of classifiers you're looking at. So for instance, if the set of classifiers are linear classifiers, then the notions, so you can imagine total variation restricted to just half spaces rather than over all possible measurable subsets of the space. So the type of result obtained along this line of research is sort of paraphrase here. It's result of the form where there is a term, OP of 1, that goes down to 0 with sample size. And then plus an additive term, which is the distance, the notion of distance considered. One of the things that brought up that brought us into this line of work was the form of this rate. The form of this rate tend to suggest that as long as P is different from Q, as long as this distance is non-zero, transfer sort of saturates, that you never get consistency. But this will turn out to be somewhat pessimistic. I'll show through various examples in a minute that this is a bit pessimistic. Even though I'll say that these are seminal work that allowed us to start thinking about the problem at all, right? So when people started thinking about the problem at all, they came up with these notions of distance that were that got us far along the way. However, much of the work that followed up kept giving rates of this form. Okay. So another line of work is essentially notions based on density ratios. And by density ratios, I mean random Nicodemus derivatives between target and source of the form dq dp. And often these are linked to particular algorithms that will do importance sampling type procedures that would reweigh the target data according to the source. And so it involves estimating this dq over dp, usually from unlabeled data. The type of bound you then get on excess target error is of this form, again, a term that goes down to 0. And then plus the estimation error of the random Nicodemus derivative. What again that tells us is that at least we don't have the saturation anymore, but what this tells us is that the problem of transfer is sort of as hard as estimating this dq over dp, which again, we will argue that this is a bit over pessimistic, because estimation of density ratios is a hard problem on its own, and it's probably harder than transfer learning itself. All right. So here, let me give you a bit more, and we'll start getting into examples where through the examples, I'll give you a sense of how appropriate these various notions of distance or divergence between distributions are. So as I said, nearly any notion that you can imagine of distance or divergence between distributions has been used. And the gist of the result tend to be, in all cases, that if these distances are small, so if the source and target are close to each other, then transfer is easy. And so that's sort of the initial result that sort of sanity check that this result gave us. And one of the questions we have automatically is, if then these notions fully tightly capture transfer, then it should also be that if P and Q appear far under these notions, that transfer should be hard. It turns out that that's not the case in various simple situations, that you can have P far from Q under these various notions, and yet transfer is not hard. Transfer is actually fairly easy. I hope that point is clear. So here, let's go back to the simple cartoons. Here again is that cartoon where we have a lot more of the triangles here than in the source. And I can make total variation large as nearly 1/2, or any of the notions that are based on total variations large. simply by looking at this area, the difference in mass between these areas. I can make it arbitrarily close to 1/2. If you recall, arbitrarily close to 1/2 would mean, would at least suggest that transfer is not possible, right? From this type of rates, the rates become vacuous. However, if you just look here, transfer should be easy in this type of cartoon, in this type of situation, because if I put a linear classifier through here, it will do just as well on the target. If I use, let's say, nearest neighbors on using the source data, will do fairly well also on the target. So in that sense, this is a situation where transfer should be easy, yet total variation and notions based on total variations will sort of suggest that transfer is hard. Here is actually another example that I'm using to give you a sense that, in fact, notions of metrics between distributions are probably inappropriate at capturing transfer. The reason is simple. If you look here, the source here has a lot of coverage of the space, so it will transfer very well to the target. The target has much less coverage of the space, and therefore, if this target were the source, it will not transfer that well to P. So P will transfer well to Q, but Q will not transfer well to P, just because Q doesn't have a good coverage, especially of the decision boundaries, right? So in that sense, transfer or domain adaptation is inherently an asymmetric problem. And so notions such as metrics that enforce symmetry in the distance between P and Q cannot really capture transfer appropriately. Here is another example where in this example now, I'm letting the target distribution sit on a lower dimensional manifold. And right away, you can tell that dq over dp, and in fact, any notion of divergence that is based on dq over dp, KL divergence, Raynier, etc., would be ill-defined and hence hard to estimate. Again, if we go back to the type of bound you can get out of these notions, the bound will become vacuous. However, this is again a situation where if I just put a linear classifier here, it will do well here also. And same thing with nearest neighbors and such, right? So transfer is not only easy in these type of situations, but it's easy under different algorithms, all right? So in that sense, these notions can be a bit pessimistic when it comes down to capturing how hard transfer is, how hard or easy transfer is. All right. So here is a notion that we will be using, proposed with Steve Haneke in 2019. So the intuition is the following. The intuition is that let's think about when is transfer sort of easy. Transfer becomes easy if, for instance, if a hypothesis has low error under the source, that's indicative of low error under the target, right? Then the source sort of has information on the target. If transfer is easy, if H has low error, it has low error on the Q. If it has low error on the P, it has low error on the Q. I hope that sinks in a little bit. So we'll try to parameterize this intuition. As a start, we'll just make a simplifying assumption, which I'll remove later. And the simplifying assumption is that the best possible classifier on the P is equal to the best possible classifier on the Q. It's just a simplifying assumption. And we come up with this notion of transfer exponent, where this notion just says that if the excess error on the P is small, then the excess error on the Q is also small, and how small depends on this parameter rho. And we call that parameter the transfer exponent. A different form of that parameter was introduced in earlier work with Guillaume Martinet. And this is a form of it in the case of finite VC classes. So we'll see that rho, this notion, captures a continuum of easy to hard transfer. So in the sense that I asked earlier, that if rho is large, then transfer will be shown to be large. If rho is easy, then transfer will be shown. If rho is small, then transfer will be shown to be easy. All right. So first, I'll give some examples to illustrate what rho really means. And again, I'll simplify things a little bit. So let's consider the case where y is deterministic. So y is a star of x. Y is produced by one of the hypotheses in the class. In this case, it's not too hard to see that the excess error with respect to h star happens to be captured just by the mass of the disagreement between the two hypotheses. Okay, wherever the two hypotheses don't agree, the mass of that is the excess error. And same thing under P. And so this relation just reduces to a relation between the marginals. And that will allow me to go through these examples, these much easier examples. Okay, here is the first example. In this example here, the hypothesis class is just threshold on the line. So if you fall on one side of the threshold, we say plus. If you fall on the other side, we say minus. So threshold on the line. And again, we just simply have to look at the mass of the disagreement regions between two hypotheses. So this is a hypothesis, this is a H star. We just have to look at the mass assigned by P to this area and the mass assigned by Q to this area. And so in this, all I'm doing is I'm letting the density of P be this uniform density over a bigger space, and the density of Q be this uniform density. The ratio of the two masses allows us to set rho to 1, where the difference in the ratio really just absorbed by the constant. So here rho is equal to 1, and we'll see that rho equal to 1 is sort of one of the best situations of transfer we can get. So rho is equal to 1, yet by just playing with this type of example, I can make notions of distance that are extensions of total variation. I can make them close to 1/4. In this example, it's 1/4, but I can make them arbitrarily close to 1/2 while keeping rho at 1. All right. So here is another example where here again the target is sitting on a manifold. The hypothesis class are linear classifiers, and the disagreement region is this here. Imagine the two distributions are uniform. Q is uniform on this, and P is uniform here. And so again, rho is 1, but KL, Rényi, and all that will blow up. Okay. So in that sense, rho is capturing these examples I showed earlier, where the other where other notions tended to be over pessimistic. I mean, one point I want to make here quickly is that the various notions of distance between distributions and divergence and all that have been created for problems to solve, to address problems other than transfer. And so hence one of the calls I'm making here is that we probably need to be looking at transfer in itself as its own problem and come up with notions that are very much in line with with the problem of domain adaptation. So here is another example. In this example here, Q, the target, is again uniform, and P has this density that vanishes around H star. Okay, it has this density that vanishes around H star. H star here is the decision boundary. H star is the decision boundary. And here, this is a case where rho is greater than 1. And if I make P vanish faster and faster around the decision boundary, I get higher and higher rhos. Okay, So rho is sort of capturing how much mass here the source is putting on the decision boundary that is important to the target. I hope that is sort of clear. This is again an example where we see the asymmetry in transfer. So if I flip things, so let's now P be uniform and Q give little mass to the decision boundary. Earlier, I had P here and Q here. Now I switched it. Q is giving little mass to the decision boundary. P is sort of uniform, gives a lot of mass to the decision boundary. Now, all of a sudden, we are in an interesting situation where rho is less than 1, okay? And we call it supertransfer. And supertransfer is a situation where, in fact, the rate of convergence you get by using the source are better than the rate of convergence you'll get by using the target, by using an equal amount of target data, right? So sort of P classification under P is much easier than classification under the target. And here again is a case where there is asymmetry. We see the asymmetry in transfer. It's easier to transfer from this distribution to this one than from this one to this one. Right. All right. So so those are various examples of rho. And I say that rho captures a performance limit on the transfer. And now I want to make that formal. So first though, a first thing is that I need to bring in another parametrization. So it turns out that how hard transfer is doesn't just depend on how far P is from Q, but it also depends on how hard the classification problem itself is. I hope that's intuitively clear, that transfer is harder if the classification problem itself that we're dealing with is hard. So we have to also parameterize how hard the classification problem is. So here is a quick cartoon of an easy classification problem and a hard classification problem. And we can tell quickly that what it has to do with is noise, is coverage of the decision boundary and noise around the decision boundary. So the two essential things we want to capture is coverage and the amount of noise in the label Y. So in classical learning theory, this is sort of captured by a so-called Bernstein class condition. And the Bernstein class condition is parameterized by this beta. And all it says is it's relating the mass of disagreement regions, disagreement between hypotheses, the mass of disagreement regions to excess risk of the hypothesis. And you can imagine that this is capturing all at once the amount of noise in Y and the mass assigned sort of to the disagreement regions. Okay, so the key things to keep in mind is this beta parameter. This beta parameter goes between 0 and 1 and captures sort of a continuum of easy to hard classification. When beta is equal to 1, classification is very easy. When beta is 0, classification is at its hardest. Classification on finite VC classes. So we'll make similar noise conditions on P. For the sake of this talk, I'll just assume that beta is the same for P and Q. Okay, so again, view it as capturing the hardness of the problem, of the classification problem itself. So we have this result on minimax rate of transfer. Again, recall the setting in which we are. We have labeled data from P of size NP and labeled data from Q of size NQ. And here I'm paraphrasing the main theorem we have. The theorem is a bit more complicated in the paper. So the theorem says the following: let H hat be any hypothesis, any algorithm trained on samples from P and Q. So H hat is returning a hypothesis from our hypothesis class, and we're equating it with the hypothesis being returned. So H hat is trained on samples from P and Q, and the best rate it can achieve, the best rate achievable is of this form. So it's a minimax rate. And the soup here is over all pairs of distributions, P and Q, that have transfer exponent rho. And noise condition beta. Okay, so let's take a look at these rates. So for those not familiar with minimax rates, all we're saying here is that there exists an algorithm that can achieve these rates. And also for any algorithm, there exists a pair of distributions satisfying all our conditions that a pair of distributions satisfying all our conditions, such as the best possible rate is this, such that these rates cannot be broken. The rate here is tight for any H. We don't make assumptions on H. H is just a finite basic class. Any rho, any beta, any NP, any NQ. So it's tight in that sense. It's tight for all the parameters. So let's sort of get a sense of what this is saying. The rate is expressed in terms of what looks like an effective sample size from the source plus the sample size from the target minus 1 over 2 minus beta. What is the minus 1 over 2 minus beta? Recall that beta is between 0 and 1. And so all this is doing is giving you a rate that goes between 1 over n and 1 over square root n. Okay, so it's the continuum of hardness of classification. If we were not in transfer, I'll just have n cubed minus 1 over 2 minus beta. So it just gives me that continuum of classification rate that I can attain. And now we have this additional term, which is sort of an effective sample size from the target. And in this sense, rho, this transfer exponent, is capturing that effective sample size. Right away, we get a sense of the benefits of unlabeled data. Why? Because the lower bounds part of the rates assumes that Px and Qx is known to the learner. So the learner has full access to the marginal distributions. And in effect, can sample an infinite number of unlabeled samples, yet it cannot beat this rate. So that answers part of the question. This doesn't take away that there might be situations that are non-minimax where you can benefit from unlabeled data, but in a minimax sense, there is no real benefit. The benefits of labeled target data. So again, recall that we started off by asking basic questions. What is the relative statistical benefit of source and target samples? So this rate sort of gives us this. It gives us a sharp threshold at which all of a sudden the target data contributes more to to decreasing the rate than the source data does. And the threshold is given, just can be read off the rate. Another question I asked earlier was about whether some notion of optimal sampling cost, financial cost, optimal sampling cost can be arrived at. And although I don't have time to talk about it, you can take this rate, you can sort of invert it with respect to sampling cost and define a notion of optimal cost, optimal sampling cost to arrive at a particular error, epsilon, let's say. So you can invert these rates to see how much you need to sample from the source, how much you need to sample from the target to minimize your total cost. And the rate depends on the unknown rho, unknown beta, and things like that. And one thing we show in the paper is that if you have access to a bit of unlabeled sample, then you can actually achieve, adaptively achieve the optimal sampling cost in some regimes. But setting up the problem itself is what is allowing us to start addressing these questions. All right, so I'll say quickly something about the lower bound analysis. All right, so one of the issues right away that we have is the sort of non-classical setting here, where we have H hat, which has access to non-identical samples. Yet, from these non-identical samples, it has to do well on Q. on the target, on just the target Q. So what we do is we construct a family of pairs of distributions indexed by H, where H rounds over the hypothesis class H. And for every H in the hypothesis class H, imagine that if I index PQ by H, then that H happens to be the best classifier for that particular PQ, okay? So we construct this family indexed by PQ, and we just impose two things, that this product distribution, PNP, Q and Q, indexed by H, are very close. Any pairs of product, any pairs H prime of product H over H prime are close in KL divergence, meaning that they are hard, data from these product distributions are hard to distinguish from each other. But are far under, for any HH prime, this pair of pairs are far under QH, okay? And far under QH enforces that they will have to necessarily incur the minimax lower bound error. So that's the sort of the key idea, and the rest is extensions of Fano inequality. For instance, particular extensions that you can find in Tibakov or in Beran and Lee. All right. So the upper bound analysis is brings up various interesting points. And again, it brings up the reason why we are actually caring about this beta parameter. Because it turns out that depending on regimes of beta, the algorithms that achieve the upper bound are different. A first thing that I have to say is that here I have to make a distinction between minimax upper bound and adaptive upper bound. So achieving this minimax upper bound in itself is not that hard, because to achieve a minimax upper bound, you assume that the algorithm has access to the distributional parameters. The algorithm knows beta and knows rho and such things. It has access to the class. So achieving this upper bound in a minimax sense is not that hard. However, what we are caring about, which is closer to practice, is how can we achieve this upper bound in practice without knowing the distributional parameters? And that's what that's why we're calling adaptivity. How can we adaptively achieve this upper bound? And that turns out to depend on this beta. So we are interested in adaptivity, at least adaptivity to rho. In practice, it turns out that estimating the distance between distributions is a hard thing. So that's another motivation for trying to understand whether we can achieve this type of rates without estimating rho by adapting to rho in some way. And recall also that rho was defined with respect to H star, which is unknown. So it's hard to estimate to start with. Okay, so here are the forms of optimal heuristics. So imagine that beta is equal to 1. I put here no classification noise. That's not quite true. It's a low classification noise. So we are in low noise regimes, very small noise when beta is equal to 1, so-called Massart noise conditions. And under this, in this regime, it turns out that ERM, empirical risk minimization, on combined source and target data is optimal, is minimax optimal, is near minimax optimal. This turns out to be one of the most naive algorithms that people use in practice, in fact. So this turns out to be minimax optimal, and that was rather interesting to us whenever we are in low noise conditions. So for unknown noise levels, let's say beta is between 0 and 1, then the optimal procedure is the following. You minimize, so it's actually close to heuristics that people use in practice. So here it just says the following: minimize the target empirical target error, minimize the target error subject to the source error, to the empirical source error not being too large with respect to to the minima, respect to the ERM error under the source. How large is this delta NP? I don't have time to get into it, but I'll just say that the delta NP is a notion of the variance, of the empirical variance of the error. So this type of heuristic can be shown to be always minimax adaptive. Okay, and why do I call it a common heuristic? It's a common heuristic in the following sense that if you have source data and target data, all this heuristic is doing is saying, first minimize your error under the source, and then rather than just only keeping the classifier data as well, keep a version space of good classifiers, and then once you have target data, minimize on the target data over that version space that you kept. And it's a very natural thing to do. And it appears, for instance, under so-called hypothesis transfer and such. All right. It doesn't seem like I have too much time. So I'm not going to get too much into the details of how these things are shown. The second one is shown on the Lepsky types argument. The first one just required some non-ID uniform Bern's type inequalities and some fixed point arguments that are often used in VC theory. All right. Okay, so I'll do a quick summary and discuss some new directions, some new interesting things we are finding. Yeah, that I'm hoping to spend about 5 minutes on. So a quick summary is this. We came up with this notion rho for VC classes that captures a more optimistic view of transferability between two distributions. The analysis under this rho reveals, allows us to classify various heuristics, which ones are optimal, which ones are not optimal, and such things. One of the things I forgot to say earlier is that this procedure, outside of this beta is equal to 1, can actually also be shown to no longer be optimal. Cost-sensitive sampling is possible without knowledge of rho. And in fact, all these optimal rates can be attained without knowledge of rho. And the result, so far I've assumed that H star P is equal to H star Q. The result in the paper, the result is extended to the case H star P different from H star Q. You just get an additive term in the rate of the form epsilon Q of H star P. So the excess error of H star P is added. All right. So current work, I'll spend about 5 minutes on this. We are currently looking at the performance limits of multitask. So what I've talked about so far is often called single source domain adaptation, because you have one source and you're trying to adapt to a single target queue. In multitask or multi-source domain adaptation is one where I have not one P, but multiple Ps. And I want to do well on the queue. The hope, however, if I have multiple Ps, is that somehow my rate of convergence should be in terms of the aggregate sample size, right? Imagine that every single source gives me 100 samples and I have 1,000 sources. Then I'm hoping that my rate of convergence will be in terms of a sample size of order 100,000. However, this is exactly what brought us to this new line of work. The last 10 years of theory on multitask and multi-source have sort of arrived at an interesting thing. All the upper bounds tend to have a worse term that are just in terms of a single source sample. So if I'm in that case where I have 1,000 sources, 100 samples per source, then the rates of convergence that have been shown so far are just in terms of 100, not in terms of 100,000. And that was quite interesting to us, and we wanted to try to understand why. And as it turns out, this is a paper we just put on arXiv a couple of weeks ago. And as it turns out, it is not possible to get a rate in multitask that is in terms of the full aggregate sample size in an adaptive manner. So what we're getting at is that there is a dichotomy between minimax rates, where in minimax rates, you can get a minimax rate in terms of aggregate sample size, and adaptive rates, where now all of a sudden the algorithm does not know anything about the distributional parameters. And adaptive rates, unfortunately, have a huge gap between the minimax rate and the minimax adaptive rate. So quickly, what's happening here is the following. We have n sources, pt, n. We're trying to transfer to q. We use transfer exponent rho t. We're going to use, again, a simple case where all the h stars are the same for all the p's and the q. So it feels like it's a very simple problem. We should be able to get a rate in terms of the aggregate sample size. So we have all these rho t's. And what we first arrive at is that the form of the minimax rate indeed is in terms of aggregate sample size. So the minimax rate in this setting are in terms of aggregate sample size and in terms of average rho t, so sort of the average distance to the target. However, the moment we start looking at adaptive strategies, again, if beta is equal to 1, so that the noise condition, if beta is equal to 1, then ERM, empirical, the naive approach of just pooling all the data together and pretending that they are all from the same distribution, so that naive approach is again minimax optimal, if beta is equal to 1. If beta is not equal to 1, for any beta, we can show that if you give us a bit of additional information, and the additional information is the following, is one where we get a ranking of all the sources with respect to the target, just a ranking. The ranking says that this source is closer than this other source to the target, okay, and close on the row. If we get such a ranking, then there exists a greedy strategy that is, again, minimax optimal, okay? However, the moment we are outside of these two regimes, beta is not 1, and there is no ranking information, then there is no adaptive strategy. No adaptive strategy exists outside of these two regimes. And the way we show it is simply by randomizing the rankings. The moment you randomize all possible rankings, then you can see that the best rate achievable is just in terms of the target sample size. Even though in the minimax regime, the best rate achievable is in terms of the aggregate sample size. So if the target sample size happened to be 100, and yet I had 100,000 samples, the best rate achievable by an adaptive procedure, which does not know any of these things, is this. And which goes back to now explaining why 10 years of research only showed multitask rates just in terms of a single sample size. All right, so I'll stop here and I'll take questions. So, and I hope so far that one of the things I was hoping to try and convince the audience of is that there are still a lot of interesting questions left in domain adaptation, multitask, one-shot learning, all these related areas have a lot of interesting questions left. And not only the questions are theoretically interesting, but they seem to be the next frontier of practice. So, all right, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the great talk. So maybe let's look at the questions. So the first question is concerning what kind of assumption on the X space are you making, whether it's a metric space or something?
Because we are looking at finite VC classes, we don't need to make any direct assumption on the space. So the assumptions really are just that we have access to these classifiers that can map from the space to the Y, to the classes. And that the classifiers themselves have bounded capacity. So in that sense that the classifiers have bounded capacity, that maybe induces some assumptions on the X space, but no direct assumptions.
Okay, so thank you. And the following up question is that, is there any dependency of the minimax rates on the size of the VC class?
Yes, I just didn't show them. So in all these rates, you can imagine dividing by VC.
Okay, thank you. So another question is, what will happen if there are two different betas for distributions P and Q?
So that's in the 2019 paper also.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So what happens is, I can explain it quickly. What happens is in this type of rates here, you get a beta P here and a beta Q here.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And the minimax rates are also shown for different betas.
Great, thank you. Another question is, for the multiple distribution setting, the multitask setting, is it possible to just reduce it to a single source setting by treating the distribution as a mixture distribution?
Yes, in some regimes, yes. In some regimes, then reduces to the single source setting in some regimes. Recall here that what we have here is we are assuming different roties for all the P's, right? And it's unclear to us that whether the average roti would be the row corresponding to the mixture or not. In all cases. In some cases, yes, but it's unclear to us whether that will be the case in all cases. However, again, these are minimax rates. Like we have matching lower bounds for every value of beta, every value of rows, every MT. So if the question is really sort of asking whether we can break these rates, we cannot break these rates. However, that's a very nice question, because there is a sense in which one might want to think about the mixture, because in some cases that are in some very nice cases, it might be that each one of the distributions is far from the target, but the mixture is close to the target. For instance, just having different coverage of different parts of the space. So we are now thinking about that, but we don't have any big thing to say yet.
Okay, thank you. And the last two questions are regarding whether it's possible to further extend the setting you just introduced. So the first one is it possible to extend the assumption that the error of the target domain is bounded by a function of the error in the source domain? Here is epsilon to the 1 divided by rho.
That the error in the target domain is bounded by, so in the definition of rho, is that what we mean?
Yes. So here,
1 second.
It's here. The epsilon, the error sub q h is bounded by some constant multiplied by the error sub p to the power of 1 over rho.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is asking whether it's possible to say something when this assumption is violated.
Okay. So here we believe that the assumptions are actually the assumption. So the quick answer is no. I don't know really what to say. However, notice that the way we set it up, rho equal to infinity is always admissible, right? Very large rho equal to infinity is always admissible. So in that sense, the question, I can reword the question as what happens at rho equal to infinity, how rich is that regime? It's unclear. It's a bit unclear to me.
Okay.
But the regime of rho non-infinity, we give a lot of examples in the paper of the regime, and to give a sense of how wide the range of distribution, the range of pairs of distributions are in that region.
Thank you. And the last question is that here in your setting, you assume that as a beginning, we have data from both P and Q. So is it possible to just look at data of P and then we have some training algorithm and finally say something about Q?
So here again, that's a nice question. Here again, I'll repeat this part is that we actually do not care what the value of NP is, what the value of NQ is in the analysis. NQ can be 0. Oh,
great. Okay, I see.
So this minimax, this performance limit are for any value of NP, any value of NQ, as I think we say, let me see, as we say here, tight for any H row, any NP, any NQ.
Okay, thank you.
Hence, that's also why I was talking about the benefits of unlabeled data, because again, H hat even has access to PX and QX. It doesn't matter. This is the match. This is the lower bound.
Okay, thank you. It seems I'm running out of the other questions, and let's thank Professor Kpotufe again for the very nice talk. And so I guess we will just stop here. And thanks everyone for joining. And we are looking forward to seeing you next week.
All right. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks everybody for being here.
Bye-bye. Bye.